Hello, everyone. I'm Denise Mouserall. I'm a professor joint between the Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment and the Civil Environmental Engineering Department. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to the David Bradford Seminar Series. Today we have the honor of having Dr. Nicky Sheats with us. Nicky is someone I first met as a graduate student at Harvard. And at the time he impressed me as having extraordinary background. He's an alum of Princeton University with an undergraduate degree in economics. He then went on to get a law degree and a master's in public policy from Harvard, and then returned again to get a PhD in earth and planetary science, which is where I first met him. He's now the director of the Center for the Urban Environment at the John Watson Institute for Public Policy at Thomas Edison State University, and has defined the primary mission of the center as providing support for the environmental justice community on both a state and on a national level. The university is located in Trenton, New Jersey. Among the issues he's working on are particulate matter air pollution, climate change, cumulative impacts, developing environmental justice legal strategies, and increasing the capacity of the environmental justice community to address these issues. Dr. Sheats was a founding member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, the Environmental Justice and Science Initiative, and an informal environmental justice attorneys group. He's been appointed to several federal and state advisory councils, including the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the EPA's Clean Air Act Advisory Committee, and the New Jersey Clean Air Council. In 2014, he also served as a co-author of the Public Health Chapter of the National Climate Assessment. Beyond his work on environmental justice, early in his career, he practiced law as a public interest attorney. During that time, he served as a law clerk for the Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, as a landlord, tenant, and housing attorney at Camden Regional Legal Services, as a public defender in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and as a legal instructor at a community legal education and college preparatory program in Harlem. We're delighted to have you here today, Nicky, and very much look forward to your sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Denise. Thanks to you and Mike Oppenheimer and everybody at the Center for inviting me. I guess I should share my screen now.
Yes, please.
There we go. And thanks for everybody who's joining us. I'm going to probably talk for about 35 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. See if I can forward my slides. There we go. So here's the title of my talk, Achieving the Emissions Reductions for EJ. You'll hear me say EJ a lot for environmental justice, achieving the emission reductions for environmental justice communities through climate change mitigation policy. And I'll just add, Denise actually already said it, but I work at Thomas Edison State University, but I'm also a member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. I wanted to start, you know a little bit about who I am. Here's a little bit more about what I do. I'm a member of the environmental justice community. You can think of me as being embedded in the environmental justice community. And I use my science and legal background to help the EJ community develop the best possible public policy from an EJ perspective. Now, I do a lot of writing, but most of it's not academic writing. A lot of it's comments that policymakers are going to read, reports. I do some academic writing. I'll actually give you a citation for a paper that I wrote about the topic today. And I write position papers, usually somewhat short, and fact sheets for communities. And my other big roles, I help build capacity for the EJ community. By that, I mean that I'm in a leadership position on a number of EJ organizations and help those EJ organizations survive. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's start by doing some EJ 101. So oftentimes you'll hear people say that the environmental justice movement is at the intersection of the civil rights and environmental movements. Within the EJ movement, sometimes we'll have the argument maybe that should be at the intersection of the Black Power movement and environmental movements, but that's an entirely different presentation. But no matter how you look at it, one thing is true. The environmental justice movement literally brings the people of color, to work on environmental issues. We are well integrated because we represent of color communities and poor communities of all colors, but the majority of EJ folks are people of color. So the EJ movement, here's a thumbnail of what the EJ movement is concerned with primarily. Disproportionate burden of pollution that you often find in of color and low income communities. And also want to make sure that these communities are involved in any decisions that affect them, the residents of the communities. And want to make sure the communities have access to benefits produced by improving the environment. Now, this is a kind of narrow definition of what the EJ community is concerned with. You know, these days you'll hear about, you know, outside of pollution reduction, you'll hear about food justice, transportation justice, climate justice, and we really consider all of those part of environmental justice. And there is a grassroots EJ movement, and mostly led by people of color, but as I said, well integrated, because that includes low income white communities. And a couple of other facts you may not know. The EJ organizations tend to be small, led by people of color, and vastly under-resourced. So there have been a couple of reports done that say that somewhere less than 5% of the money, the funds that go to environmental issues, go to EJ organizations. And you should also know that there can be, and there is tension between the EJ movement and environmental movements. So think of us as a family. By that I mean we're dysfunctional. We work together at times and we fight at times. But the environmental justice movement, and this is me saying this, so my opinion, the core difference is that the environmental justice movement is concerned mostly about protecting communities. Now, the environmental justice movement is concerned about protecting the earth, but its primary purpose is to protect communities. Whereas the environmental movement, its primary function or its primary concern is to protect the earth. Now, it's concerned about communities, but its primary function is to protect the environment. So because of those kind of core differences, sometimes we do come to different policy conclusions and have different policy positions. So you see some of the EJ organizations as an example. These are organizations I'm a member of. My home EJ organization is the New Jersey EJ Alliance, and these other organizations you see are either national or regional. The ones in parentheses means it's not fully environmental justice or only environmental justice. It also includes other types of organizations. All right, let's go to the substance. And I'm going to start with a slide that I have shown all over the country. And in fact, I've shown it so much that my EJ colleagues tease me about this. But I'll say what I always say, I don't care, because I have a new audience to show it to. So this slide shows the relationship between cumulative impacts, race, and income. And one reason I like to show it is because it really shows why many of us are part of the EJ community. So in this instance, you can think of cumulative impacts informally as a very rough estimate of the total amount of pollution in a community. If you want a more formal definition, ask me during the question and answer period, I'll give that to you. So these figures were produced by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in 2009, using data from the late 1990s, early 2000s, I believe. And what they first did was estimated cumulative impact score, or developed a cumulative impact score for each neighborhood in New Jersey. And then they asked the question, well, what's the relationship between these cumulative impact score, which again, you can think of as an estimate of the total amount of pollution in the neighborhood, and race and income. So they graphed it. And you can see the result, what I call at various times, shows a very troubling relationship between these factors, or unholy relationships. I'm feeling very bad that day, between these variables. But look at the top figure, and you can see that as the number of people of color in the neighborhood increases, so does the estimate of the amount of total pollution in neighborhoods. And the same thing for people living in poverty. As the number of low-income people living in a New Jersey neighborhood increases, so does the estimate of the amount of pollution in that neighborhood. So I'll say what I said all over the country. What this is providing evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to race and income, to the amount of money in your pocket and the color of your skin. And that goes against everything that the country and our state at least claim that they stand for. And a couple of other things about these figures on why I like to show them. To the right of your screen are environmental justice neighborhoods, right? Communities of color, low-income communities. And you can see that they're estimated to have a disproportionate amount of pollution within their borders. Just to give you an example, there are not labels on here, but if you look to the right of your screen at the top figure, Newark is about, I think, 88% of color. So you can see where it falls in these graphs. Now, the EJ community, EJ movement thinks that we're going to have to develop multiple strategies to address the disproportionate amount of pollution that these graphs are showing are estimated to be in EJ communities. And some of those strategies will address cumulative impacts directly. And in fact, we just passed a landmark cumulative impacts bill in New Jersey. But other of those strategies will address parts of the disproportionate amount of pollution. And so one strategy, one type of policy that the EJ community feels strongly should be used to address this disproportionate amount of pollution is climate change mitigation strategy. So these graphs are giving the motivation in large part, in some part, to the rest of my talk. And I should also mention that the relationship between race, income, and pollution is not unique to New Jersey. If other states did similar investigations, many of them would probably find something similar. And in fact, part of what started the EJ movement back in the late 1980s were national investigations that found similar relationships on the national level. So I said the climate change mitigation policy is one type of policy the EJ community thinks should be used to address climate change. So let's talk about climate change mitigation policy. And as I'm assuming this crowd knows, is listening now, the main point of climate change mitigation policy is to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, usually carbon dioxide. Doesn't hurt to say it again, though. But from an EJ point of view, here's one of the main premises of the talk. From an EJ point of view, one of the main purposes of climate change mitigation policy should be to produce emissions reductions in or for EJ communities. And let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Look at the top paragraph there. I'm going to take you through that, and that's the main point of the talk. Once you understand that, I could really stop talking, but I won't. I like to talk. But let's go through it. So from an EJ point of view, what we want from climate change mitigation policy, in addition to fighting climate change, is guaranteed emissions reductions in the near EJ communities, preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized, but reductions either way. All right, what does all this mean? Well, we know what an EJ community is, right? You saw from the graphs, communities of color and low-income communities. How about the guaranteed emissions reductions? Well, we're talking about power plants in this case. I'm talking about the power generation sector. So we want emissions reductions from plants in the near EJ communities, no matter what type of climate change mitigation policy they are subject to. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized. We know what a greenhouse gas is. We usually talk about carbon dioxide. What's a greenhouse gas co-pollutant? Well, think about power plants. They not only emit a lot of greenhouse gases, I think about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide in the country. Maybe that's a date, maybe that figure's dated. But along with carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, they also emit other air pollutants. The ones we're particularly worried about from an EJ point of view are fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. Talk a little bit more about that. And these other pollutants that are emitted along with carbon dioxide, if you're talking about climate change mitigation policy, are referred to as greenhouse gas co-pollutants. Now, remember that carbon dioxide is not thought to hurt you directly. How carbon dioxide hurts us is by causing climate change, and then climate change hurts you. But these other co-pollutants, do have harmful local health impacts. So what we would want from, ideally what we would want from climate change mitigation policy is to design a policy where the strategies used achieve whatever carbon dioxide reduction goal you've set. So if it's a 15% reduction of carbon dioxide, you want the strategies to achieve that reduction, but you also want to develop strategies that maximize the amount of co-pollutant reductions while they are achieving your carbon dioxide reduction. Now, no climate change mitigation policy that I know of does that. So what we're saying in the EJ community is we'll take the next best thing and we'll say, well, let's make sure we get carbon dioxide reduction from power plants in EJ communities, right? From plants whose emissions significantly impact EJ communities. And in that way, we're going to get some incidental co-pollutant reduction. It won't be as much as if we intentionally maximize co-pollutant reduction, but we'll take what we can get. And it should be significant. And remember, we want to reduce these co-pollutants so we can improve the health of local communities, especially those EJ communities that frequently suffer from a disproportionate amount of pollution. The co-pollutant that we are typically most concerned about is fine particulate matter. And again, just want to remind you, we're talking about power plants that impact EJ communities. Here's a little bit more about co-pollutants. We're talking about fine particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, HAPs, hazardous air pollutants. Fine particulate matter, which is the one we're typically most concerned about, are small particles, small airborne particles, less than 2.5 microns in diameter. Size makes a difference because that's small enough to get into your lungs and to cause havoc. A 2007 study, I believe, from MIT, I should update this, estimated that fine particulate matter alone contributed to 200,000 premature deaths in our country. Now here's a slide I usually don't, check on my time, I usually don't talk about because I usually don't have time. But since the center has granted me a long time to talk today, relatively, I'll talk about this slide. And this is a permit from air pollution permit from the latest natural gas plant in New Jersey that is sited in Newark. State-of-the-art plant, is probably the least polluting plant, I would guess anyway, in the state. And remember, this is what is allowed, the amount of pollution is allowed to produce, not what it actually produces. And the point of this slide is that if you add up all the co-pollutants that it produces, and I should have looked at the paper I wrote so I won't make a mistake with this figure. But I believe the figure I came up with was, if I did the calculation correctly, is that it's about 1.8 million pounds of co-pollutants a year. Now look, in terms of all the air pollution in Newark, that's a very small percentage. But in terms of the absolute amount of air pollution, I would argue to you that that's a large amount. And if you live near that plant in Newark, you're not happy about that. And I make this point because at various times, both the EPA and New Jersey DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, have referred to the amount of pollution produced by these kind of state-of-the-art natural gas plants as negligible. And so we disagree that the co-pollutants produced by these plants, the amount is negligible. And we think we should find ways to reduce the amount produced by these plants. So climate change mitigation policy gives us the opportunity to do that, is what we're arguing. So it gives us the opportunity not only to fight climate change, but to drive down concentrations of fine particulate matter and other greenhouse co-pollutants to levels we've not been able to achieve so far by using policies that are in play now to reduce emissions and lower concentrations of these co-pollutants. So we think that by adding climate change mitigation policy on top of policies being used now, we can drive down concentrations of these co-pollutants to lower and lower levels. And this is important because as the science is telling us, take fine particulate matter, there's no lower threshold of ambient concentrations of fine particulate matter below which, if you keep driving it down, you don't get health benefits. Let me say that in English. We want to drive down concentrations of fine particulate matter as low as possible. And if we use climate change mitigation policy in this way, we would start saving lives in communities and reducing illnesses in communities, especially EJ communities, but all communities. We would start saving lives, having health benefits right away. Right? We wouldn't have to wait for the next climate change event. We wouldn't have to wait for the next heat wave or the next extreme storm before these policies would start saving lives. And look, I'm not minimizing the impact of climate change mitigation policy. We know in New Jersey the detrimental impacts that can happen from severe storms. But what I am saying is that if we use climate change mitigation policy in this way, it would make these policies immediately relevant to environmental justice and other communities. And it would bring these communities into discussion, because it would make these policies immediately relevant to these communities, because we're starting improving the health of these communities right away. It would start bringing these communities into the conversations about climate change in a way that many times there is not always done. It's not often done. Many times, low-income communities and communities of color are missing from these conversations. Back to the need, go back to the co-pollutants. The co-pollutants are an EJ issue in and of themselves, because air pollution is, because numerous studies have found that there is disproportionate exposure to air pollution in EJ communities. So that's why we need to reduce concentration of these pollutants in these communities. And these co-pollutants are part of the disproportionate pollution burden in these communities. And you see, I'm just gonna put a hint out there. I could use some ingenious students, I know a few, that could help me update my citations. So I think I've stated the main recommendation for you, right? And that's that, let's restate it here. We want to use, from EJ perspective, we want to use climate change mitigation policy, not only to fight climate change, but to address a disproportionate amount of pollution often found in low-income communities and communities of color. So what's the problem? This seems to the environmental justice community to be fairly straightforward. The main purpose of climate change mitigation policy is to reduce emissions. So let's tweak it some and make sure we get those reductions in EJ communities. Well, from an EJ point of view, part of the problem is that the main policy mechanism that our country is using to fight climate change now is carbon trading. Right now, New Jersey, to bring it down to a state level, is part of a carbon trading program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI for short. And again, from an EJ perspective, one of the problems of carbon trading is that it does not mandate emissions reductions at any specific facility or location. So for example, in New Jersey, if you want to get a 15% reduction of carbon dioxide, as long as the plants under the carbon trading system in New Jersey collectively get a 15% reduction in carbon dioxide, then that's fine. It doesn't mandate, though, that that plant in Newark will reduce its emissions. And so in this way, it leaves equity to chance, or more particular, what I would say later, it leaves it up to the market. But if you define equity as the distribution of emissions reductions, you know, the carbon trading is leaving that up to chance. And what we think is ironic, maybe there's a better word for it, is that under carbon trading or other pure market mechanisms, you don't have a guarantee that you'll get emissions reductions in the communities with the most pollution. Now, let me be careful here. What I'm not saying is that under carbon trading, you won't ever get reductions in EJ communities. Three things can happen to emissions in EJ communities under carbon trading. They can increase, that's the worst case scenario. They can stay the same, or they can be reduced. Now, what I am saying is that under carbon trading system, you won't have guaranteed emissions reductions in EJ communities. So the question under carbon trading system will be, how many EJ communities will have emissions reductions? Which ones will have emissions reductions? What will be the extent of those reductions? And will they be consistent over time? And these are all questions that from an EJ point of view, we need to cure by ensuring that we have those reductions in EJ communities. So that's a problem. These questions are a problem from an EJ perspective. And the solution I've suggested to you is, okay, let's identify those plants that significantly impact EJ communities and force them to reduce emissions. The concept is simple, but we understand that the implementation will not be as straightforward. And there will be, you know, multiple questions connected to the implementation that we have to work out. A couple of them are, well, what exactly is an EJ community? You've heard me say that there are communities of color and low-income communities, but right, we need a more definitive definition. We need a more discrete definition of EJ communities. And you notice I haven't said by how much, what should be the extent of reductions under this kind of recommendation. In the paper that I wrote, we suggested 25%, but between me and you, that was a figure we threw out to start the discussion. So let me reiterate some of the arguments before I close. Climate change mitigation policy should yield reductions above and beyond those produced by other sections of the Clean Air Act. So I should say by the Clean Air Act. And this is an important argument to reiterate, because a lot of times people will say to me, look, we already have laws and strategies to reduce the co-pollutants you're talking about. So Sheats, why are you complaining? Why do you want to mess with our climate change mitigation policy when we already have this covered? And again, the answer is we think we can get deeper cuts in emissions, lower ambient concentrations, if we use climate change mitigation policy in addition to those other policies that are already being used to reduce emissions of the co-pollutants. And remember cumulative impacts. In many EJ communities, you have multiple sources of pollution and you have multiple pollutants. And there's not a standard for the cumulative amount of pollution in a neighborhood. The way our country tries to regulate pollution is we set a standard for individual pollutants, but we don't take into account the total amount of pollution in a neighborhood. So even if each pollutant is under its separate standard, what about the total amount of pollution in a neighborhood? And as I've already argued to you, even there still may be and undoubtedly are detrimental health impacts, even from the individual pollutants, even if they're meeting their standard. So we've come to say we're going to need cumulative policies to address cumulative impacts. And we recognize that even if we use climate change mitigation policy in the way I'm suggesting, in the way we're suggesting, from the EJ community is suggesting, it won't be a silver bullet. we're going to have to combine it with other policies. But it will have an impact. Let's take a step back. I've kind of argued, made a specific argument. Take a step back and take a broader view. What we're saying here is that environmental justice and equity should be an integral part of any climate change mitigation policy. And it shouldn't be left, EJ and equity should not be left to be addressed later. Yeah, this drives the EJ community a little bit crazy, because a lot of times what the EJ community hears is that, well, we're gonna go forward with this climate change mitigation policy, this carbon trading policy, maybe another type of policy, even though it doesn't specifically address equity. You're gonna get some benefits because we're gonna address the overall problem. And we'll specifically address equity later. And the biggest argument we hear is, well, we're gonna take the revenue produced by carbon trading, because it does produce revenue, and we're gonna use that to invest in EJ communities later to achieve emissions reductions. And the problem with that from an EJ point of view is, one thing is already what I'm suggesting. We're hearing, okay, we're gonna do the climate change mitigation policy later, and we'll get to we're gonna do the climate change mitigation policy now, and we'll get to your EJ and equity issues later. And the state of New Jersey is proposing this. But the problems we have are that the programs they're suggesting have not been fully developed. We don't know how much reduction they will achieve. We don't know which communities they will be applied to. We don't know when they will start. What would be the time frame. We don't know exactly how much money will be spent on them. So there's a lot that we don't know. And again, from an EJ point of view, that's not sufficient. And again, we don't think the market should make decisions about EJ and equity. We don't think the market should decide where those critical emissions reductions occur. We think they should be planned and intentional. A little bit about what we're doing in New Jersey, because remember, so I'm working on both a state level, and a local level, and a national level. But here in New Jersey, as I've mentioned, New Jersey is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is 10 northeastern states, the carbon trading system. And New Jersey was one of the original members, entered under, I guess, Governor Corzine. Governor Christie pulled us out. One of the first things Governor Murphy did was to put us back in, over the objections of the EJ community, by the way, because the environmental justice community, for large part for the reasons I've stated here, doesn't guarantee reductions in EJ communities, did not support New Jersey going back into RGGI. But we couldn't stop it. We don't have that kind of political power, which also worries us about the promise of spending money future in EJ communities, because we know we don't have the political clout maybe to really impact where those funds will go. But what we did was, since we were put back in the RGGI over the objections of the EJ community, we went to the state and said, well, to make this a little bit more EJ friendly, why don't you integrate this mandatory emissions reduction proposal into New Jersey's RGGI operating rule? So the last time we made that suggestion officially was sometime in late 2018, and we are still waiting for an answer. Although I guess I'm sorry, I always say this, starting to say this anyway, if you don't get an answer in that amount of time, you've probably received your answer. Let me finish by saying this and issuing a bit of a challenge. We hear a lot from the EJ community, hears a lot from various folks, environmental groups, policymakers, universities, that EJ and equity are priorities for them. And so if that is true, then the challenge I'm going to issue is, if EJ and equity are priorities for you, then make obtaining emissions reductions for environmental justice communities from climate change mitigation policy as important as obtaining greenhouse gas reductions, right? I want folks to put their policies where their mouths are. And if you're willing to make, and this has a lot of implications, which we can talk about, if you're willing to make obtaining these co-pollutant reductions that I've talked about as important as obtaining greenhouse gas reductions, you're going to make the little girl there who's from an EJ community happier than she is now. That's it. Here's a citation for the paper that I wrote on this recommendation. I laugh because if you need something to put you to sleep, read the paper. You might actually enjoy it, but it does have what I talked about today in it. So thanks a lot. I guess I should unshare my screen, and I'll turn it over to, I think Denise is going to officiate questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nikki. I think Keely may put my video back on.
Okay.
But in the meantime, thank you for that fascinating and important talk. I fully and completely support the idea of co-benefits in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. And it seems like there's real opportunities for that type of co-benefit so that the EJ community might benefit by looking at synergies there, in my opinion. So for example, increased stringency of air pollutant emissions from power plants, which is the direct control of the pollutants which affect health, can have huge impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. For example, increased stringency on SO2 and nitrogen oxide emissions from coal-fired power plants has been one of the factors that has forced coal-fired power plants to shut down because it's too expensive to put those end-of-pipe controls on them. So rather than having the EJ community argue against greenhouse gas emissions, I could see huge opportunities to join forces and work together to get these co-benefits implemented. And the other thought I had before I turn it over to the list of questioners we have popping up now is that relatively small amounts of fine particle matter come from something like a gas-fired power plant. The data you showed indicated certainly not zero, but relatively large amounts of fine particles come from things like poorly tuned vehicles or diesel engines from large trucks and things like that, which I think are also fairly frequent in low-income EJ communities. And so there could be real synergies there, again, if there could be increased electrification, where vehicles become electrified, and therefore those individual vehicles don't emit those particles at all. And so again, some kind of coordinated effort between the environmental groups and the EJ groups could have real co-benefits for everyone in terms of electrifying with increased penetration of renewable energy, greening the grid as New Jersey has committed to doing, and then electrifying sectors so that the end of pipe emissions decrease. I don't know if you want to respond to those thoughts, or you prefer to.
We're in basic agreement, but I would say, when I showed the permit, I think the permit says that plant can emit up to 100 tons of fine PM a year. And, and I would argue that is a lot, and it's probably the single largest. I don't know this for sure, so I'm going out on a limb. Let me say it this way. One of the single largest emitters of fine particulate matter in that county, I would predict. Yeah, and probably. I agree with what you said about mobile sources. So that's why we're advocating for all those policies. That's why I said cumulative policies to address cumulative impacts. So we think you're going to have to do multiple policies. And actually, Denise, you're clairvoyant. We're arguing just what you said. When it comes to transportation, one of the things we've been arguing, and people are starting to listen, the initial focus on transportation was on cars, which, you got to address cars. There's so many of them. But don't leave out the diesel-powered vehicles, especially in urban areas. So we're really advocating for, to look at buses and trucks. And unfortunately, I'm getting too old for this, but one of the big fights that's looming is there's going to be something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, TCI, that is going to address mobile sources. And the fight we're having is that what they've developed so far is a carbon trading system. And that's at the core of the policy. And they're going to, and see how I said it, they're going to develop what they're calling complementary policies to address emissions specifically in EJ communities. And we're trying to get them to shift that. We're like, well, let's make these policies you're calling complementary, let's make them the core policies of this program as opposed to the carbon trading. But there's going to be a lot of action around the mobile sources.
Good, that seems valuable. And as far as emissions trading goes, a lot depends on the level of the cap. If the cap means a 50% cut from previously, the benefits for everyone are probably far larger than if it's a 10% cap. So it's also something to think about. But let me turn, I'd love to talk to you more later. Obviously, we have a lot of things in common that would be great to follow up with. But let me turn over to some of the other people who've asked questions. Lisa Nicolason, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Nikki. Hi, Denise. I'm Lisa Nicolason. I'm with the Office of Sustainability here at Princeton. And my question was, how can Princeton University and other higher ed institutions form authentic relationships with their local EJ communities and most effectively support their work?
That's a good question. One we're going to be thinking about, right, Denise? Okay, so let me say this. More EJ 101. The relationships between universities and EJ groups, by and large, has not been a good one. Because, and part of that is going back to the resource question, where I said EJ groups are very under-resourced. And part of that is that universities as large institutions and well-known institutions at times have come and gotten money, obtained money from foundations for EJ work. And you know, EJ groups have not been able to obtain money as easily. Money always causes tension, doesn't it? So that has caused some tension. And so, for example, you know, I work in a university, it's actually a virtual university. So I'm not involved in the day-to-day teaching, but I run a center. Up until now, I have never asked for funding from my center separate from an EJ group. Because, you know, I knew that it wouldn't set a good precedent to get money if the New Jersey EJ Alliance couldn't get money. And so we just have to be careful about those relationships. We have to set them up so they're not what the EJ community would say extractive. And in the near future, maybe, you know, we may be able to do that at Princeton, make sure we set up the relationship so there's benefit both ways.
Okay, thank you for that. Rohit Gupta, would you like to ask your question, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you. Not see you, but hear you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nikki and Denise. My question is that for implementing EJ, what do you feel should be the role of the state government and federal government so that it's implemented in letter and spirit?
Say that last sentence again. What should be the role of the government in?
The federal government and the state government. So in terms of implementing EJ, what should be the federal government doing and what should be the state governments doing in US so that it is being done effectively? Yeah,
so it's being done properly. Well, one hallmark of EJ is that it needs robust public participation, meaningful public input. So that means having input that can actually change a decision of the federal government and reaching out proactively to these communities at the beginning of a process, not making a decision and then taking it to the community and say, what do you think about this? But trying to have community voices involved from the beginning. Now, let me say this. Excuse me, we were talking a little bit before the webinar began. The EJ community has been discovered by the Democrats. So we've worked recently in the last 3 years on several bills with Democrats in Congress. And we've had several bills submitted. And one of the key features of the bill was a bill we worked with Senator Booker and got a bill submitted in 2017, which was updated in 2019. And we got the New Jersey EJ Alliance coordinated input from all over the country from EJ groups. And what was very important from at least New Jersey and all EJ folks' point of view is that it included addressing cumulative impacts. And for the first time in a bill that we know of, it said that not only should cumulative impacts be considered, but that under some circumstances, pollution permits should be denied based on cumulative impacts. And that was a holy grail issue of the EJ community, that you can't just keep putting more and more polluting facilities in the same community. And that bill has been followed up with a similar bill from Representatives Grijalva and Mitigation in the House. And that influence, remember I said we had a landmark state bill passed on cumulative impacts. That influenced and kind of provoked passing that bill in New Jersey. So those bills though have been submitted on the national level, but of course have not been passed by Congress. And we need, the emissions reduction I've been talking about, climate change mitigation policy. Eventually we're looking to have legislation around that to make sure climate change mitigation policy is implemented or guarantees reductions in EJ communities. And then you can talk about energy bills too. I think Denise already mentioned renewable energy efficiency. How do we make sure that EJ communities have access to those? So that, that's a whole legislative agenda, right, that we could try to get passed.
Great, thanks for those insights. Michael Oppenheimer has a question.
Yes, hi. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Michael.
So the argument about cumulative impacts, I've always found it to be very, it's an excellent framing, and factually, it's just always been the case that it's been important but totally ignored. We're moving into a different situation if Biden wins the election, namely the frame that presumably he'll work from is something that looks like the Green New Deal. And emissions trading or any carbon pricing has a very secondary role in that discussion and in what we know about what people expect out of the Green New Deal. And in fact, even in New Jersey, a lot of the energy policy has been dominated by a very pervasive renewable portfolio standard rather than emissions trading, although emissions trading is clearly important too. So my question is, how would you, does this impending importance of a Green New Deal framework, should the Democrats win the election, change the strategy for you? It sort of seems to tee up the arguments you've been making. On the other hand, if a carbon price isn't really important in the mix, it's the target you're going to have to aim for is different than the one you've been aiming at. How does that change things, both from a substantive point of view, but also from a messaging point of view?
So I think so. You say the framework of the Green New Deal. So New Jersey EJ Alliance is part of a national platform called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which when you say the framework of the Green New Deal, I'm not sure what that framework is. It probably converges on what we're talking about in the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, where we talk about very much near terms of what I've been saying here, Michael. We talk about cumulative impacts You know, it's a climate platform, but we make connections to all these other issues. And we do talk in terms of cumulative impacts and mandatory emissions reductions. And so when we say mandatory emission reductions, what we say is that no matter what type of climate change mitigation policy you have, whether it's regulatory or market-based, you know, you have to find a way to get those mandatory emission reductions in EJ communities. And you know, we say well, we don't say in the platform. We leave that alone because it's in conjunction with EJ groups and environmental groups. We don't talk specifically about carbon trading because, you know, we don't have agreement about that. So that's why we talk about mandatory emissions reductions and saying, hey, no matter what, that's what you have to, that's what we need to achieve. And so I think that's the framework we've been working from, Michael, and saying now, how are we going to achieve those mandatory emissions reductions? You know, we prefer to do it through regulations, but you know, the EJ community side says that, but let's talk and figure out how we're going to do that. And I totally agree with you. We're hoping that we really have that opportunity coming up. And for example, the bills that I talked about so far, we knew those were marker bills. We had them submitted not because we thought they were going to pass, but we wanted to keep the discussion on EJ alive and influence state work. But if, you know, we have the opportunity, we're going to go back and try to pass those bills. Now they deal with cumulative impacts. Then we'll have to develop legislation, Michael, around, I think, climate change. That's going to be a tougher nut to crack because of the, you know, kind of differences. But we think the framework of mandatory emissions reduction might produce policies that we can both agree to. We'll have to see. But that is the way we're approaching it so far.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Another question from Christine Symington, I think related to an earlier part of your discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yes, you started to answer the question, or you did answer it, Nikki, about the Transportation Climate Initiative being considered, and what can it do that Reggie didn't to ensure that EJ community gets guaranteed benefits? You mentioned diesel, but could you be more specific about what it should do that Reggie didn't do?
Well, again, we're going to get into the argument about, you know, the carbon trading. We don't think it should be, we don't think it should have a carbon trading core. And we were, you know, we were like, look, you know, if we want to work together here, can we find something that we can all agree to as opposed to something that splits progressive community? So we think at the core, instead of carbon trading, it should be policies that get the reduction of carbon dioxide, but also get those reductions in EJ communities. They guarantee those reductions in EJ communities. And even more so now, you know, in this atmosphere where we have Black Lives Matter, the new attention to social justice, we're like, this is the time, you know, this is the time to come together and do this and make sure it has a core that addresses both of these issues, you know, at the same time. And maybe, let me take a minute and say this. I started to say this because it relates to where we are now. You know, carbon trading, and look, I was trained in classic free market economics when I was at Princeton, but you know, that was created by economists who argue, look, it's more efficient, you get the same reductions at least cost. But it doesn't address justice and equity. And so, you know, I'm starting to ask folks, is this where we are as a society where maybe our most important environmental policy at its core is worried about reductions, but then the next most important thing is cost? You know, and I would argue the next most important thing, or co-equal, should be reductions and equity. And instead of having cost as an objective, it should be a constraint. We got to talk about cost. I'm not saying you don't, but I'm arguing it should be a constraint instead of one of the goals. And right now, it's kind of the other way around, right? Cost is one of the goals, and equity and justice, if we're lucky, it's starting to happen, act as a constraint. And I think we need to flip that.
Thank you.
That's a super persuasive argument. I was wondering though if the EJ community would be satisfied with a layered approach, if it's cap and trade, but then with an additional constraint that emissions cannot exceed more than a certain threshold within any community.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what, let me be careful how I put it, Denise. That's kind of what we're arguing with this, right? That you have the cap and trade, but you can call them emission limits on plants in EJ communities. Now,
everywhere, right? So that no place can have emissions above an acceptable threshold or something like that.
Well, no, what we're arguing in this iteration is that it's particularly only for plants that impact EJ communities. That we have to identify those plants impacting EJ communities and limit them. Now, that is not our first choice. So for example, when I say I have to be careful, the way we phrase this is we're still not endorsing carbon trading with this mechanism, but it is better than if it doesn't have this mechanism. So, we're phrasing it like that. And one reason, just to be transparent, we're phrasing it like that is because we don't want the proliferation of carbon trading around the country, which we've heard about. And we want to say, our first choice is still regulations. We think that it's better for EJ communities. Now, if we're in a situation where we're bowled over like we are in New Jersey, okay, then let's look at the suggestion we're making here. I'm sorry,
Okay.
that's part of your political answer.
That's very interesting and valuable. Thanks for sharing that. We have time for one more question, and there's an anonymous person who asked a question I think that's really interesting, so I'm just going to read it to you.
Sure.
It says, to your equity and EJ point, what are your thoughts about New Jersey's new food waste recycling legislation? How can it be implemented to ensure air pollution reduction specifically in EJ communities near waste incinerators?
Yeah, I'm going to punt. I know about it, but I don't know enough to give you an intelligent answer on that. I think.
Okay, well, in that case, then we'll go on to someone else. Bettina Bergu, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. I know we're really short on time, so I just wanted to ask, and thank you for being here, by the way, for a couple more comments on the new New Jersey EJ law. In what ways is it really path-breaking, and what is missing, in your opinion?
What is missing in the law?
Yes.
Well, it is path-breaking because of what I said earlier. It not only calls for, so let me tell you what the law is. The law identifies what it calls overburdened communities, but really EJ communities through a combination of race and class. And then it says, if you're seeking a pollution permit in these communities, you got to do an environmental justice analysis. And if that analysis shows that the cumulative environmental and health impacts are higher in the community where the facility wants to be sited than other non-EJ communities in the state, then if you're asking for a new permit, it shall be denied. If you're asking for a renewal of a permit or for a permit that allows a facility expansion, conditions can be put on it that will address the result of having higher cumulative impacts. It's groundbreaking because it calls for, well, it mandates permits be denied based on cumulative impacts in certain circumstances. So that's groundbreaking. We're getting people from all over the country contacting us. Could have been stronger if, and this is how we had it at first, but gets changed in the sausage making, if those permits for renewal could be denied also and for expansion. But they can't be denied. They can only be conditioned.
Interesting. Thank you so much. It was a great insight into EJ issues. We really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. And I think we have the option to allow people who need to go now to go, since it's now a bit after 1:15, and to invite those who want to ask you some additional questions. If you have time to stick around for a few minutes, we can try and simulate what would typically happen at the end of a seminar and have people informally ask you questions at the end.
Okay. I think have certain appointments to talk to people starting at 1:30.
Oh, okay. So if you need a break, then we can end now and you can.
No, I'm fine.
You're fine. Okay. And I look forward to catching up with you later.
Okay.
So thanks again very much for coming. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
And with that, I think we'll officially close the session and invite those who want to ask questions to go ahead and do so. Thanks everyone for coming.